We can thank Thomas Wise last week for kind of finishing off Romans chapter 12 for us and transitioning us to Romans chapter 13. What a wonderful chapter it is. We are going to kind of skip the introductory verses of this particular chapter. Not that we're not going to hit them, but we're going to do them a little bit later because they talk about a very specific topic that I want to address. Just want to spend a little more time with it. He talks about kind of our relationship to those who are around us in worldly authority, the power of the government, the need for us to have a responsibility toward those who are about us in that capacity. But we're going to go down in just a moment or two. We're going to read verses 8 through 10. Verses 8 through 10 of chapter 13. Most of us know a guy by the name of Robert E. Lee as a general in an army that fought against the Union soldiers as part of what we call typically the Civil War. Most of us probably don't realize that he went on, he retired, and he became the president of a university. He became a president of the university, and the university was called the Washington and Lee University. And the story is told about one day, him as president being in his office when a young student came in seeking his counsel. Now, I don't imagine that happens too much today. I don't remember having free access to the president of any college I ever went to. But, that was a different era. So this young student comes in and he has this audience with Lee. And he's perplexed somewhat. He's new to the school, he's come, and he's never had anybody tell him what the guidelines and the rules are. So he decides he's going to go right to the top, and he goes to Lee and very, just kind of abruptly says to him, is there a way that I can get a copy of the rules and regulations for the school? So that I know what is the right thing to do, what is the wrong thing to do, what is the requirement. And it is said in the story that Lee responded simply by saying, son, there's only one rule. Be kind in all things, in every way, to everyone, in all the ways you know how. And you can't go wrong. And I thought that was a wonderful story. Kindness is certainly one of those attributes that we have to have. And kindness, of course, is one of the things that grows out of the fact that God calls us to love. He himself is love. And because he is love, he is benevolent toward us. And of course, we've said this. If we've said it once, we've said it 1,000 times. Because God is that way, there is the righteous expectation that we will be that way. That we will, because we are loving, for the sake of being a loving person, rather than because someone deserves our love. Because we are loving people, we will be kind to other people. Now, that's sometimes hard, isn't it? I mean, that's a difficult thing at times. And we're going to look at some difficult areas, tonight with regard to this and what Paul says here in Romans chapter 13. Because sometimes it is difficult to love. Now, when we talk about that idea, perhaps most of our minds are going to that passage, you remember, where Christ challenges us to love our enemies. Yeah, that's a challenging passage. The kids and I, and Josh, and most people know Josh, and by now he's been here enough, went and saw God's Not Dead 2 today. And if you like the first one, you will love the second one tenfold. It's even better. And just a great movie. But, there's this scene in the movie where, they're talking about some of these things. There's a young man who's really, really struggling. And he comes to the minister. And he says, I've got all these questions. And the minister says, well, okay, what's your question? He says, well, I have about 147 questions that I want to ask you. He says, well, let's just start with the first one. And he said, I've been reading in the Beatitudes here. And the more I read, the more impossible it seems that I can actually fulfill these things. That I can actually do them. So, there are things that on the surface look quite difficult about this whole love notion. And yet, we find that, like many things that we kind of look at and think, that's too hard, or how could I ever do that? That's kind of the point, isn't it? I mean, we kind of, not kind of, we have to, in order to accomplish many of those things, have this full reliance upon God and who He is. And quite frankly, that's the only way we accomplish certain things that we are called to do. When we fully rely upon God and who He is. Kindness is one of those things. Because like you said, it's not always easy to be kind. I don't know who wrote this, but I've had it in kind of my files for years, and I just want to take a minute and read it to you. It says, if you were busy being kind, before you knew it, you would find, you'd soon forget to think 'twas true that someone was unkind to you. If you were busy being glad and cheering people who are sad, although your heart might ache a bit, you'd soon forget to notice it. If you were busy being good and doing just the best you could, you'd not have time to blame some man who's doing just the best he can. If you were busy being right, you'd find yourself too busy quite to criticize your neighbor long because he's busy doing wrong. Kindness, goodness, all of these things are things that grow from this quality of love that God tells us we're supposed to have. Now, Paul in Romans 13 doesn't have your normal discussion about love. As a matter of fact, when we look at these passages, we don't think of them as the great love verses of the Bible. And rarely when we talk about love do we include these particular passages. But I want you to read them with me, just very quickly, verses 8 through 10. Owe no one anything. Well, that doesn't really say too much about love, now does it? Or it doesn't seem to. But it says, owe no one anything, except love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Do you notice which word is mentioned more in this context than any of the others? Love. But then notice the topics that we're talking about. This is not your normal juxtaposition of ideas here with regard to love, especially this first one. Owe no one anything. But there are three things that I want to kind of point out about love that Paul details for us here. Number one, because we love, or because you are love like God is love, then you pay your debts. You pay your debts. The story is told about a young man who went off to college, and he's there for about almost a year, and he calls back and he says, Dad, you gave me some horrible advice. And his dad's, what horrible advice is that? Well, you told me to put all my money in that bank, and he said the name of the bank. And the father said, well, yeah. He said, well, they're having trouble. And the father said, what do you mean they're having trouble? They're one of the largest banks in the country. As a matter of fact, they're one of the largest banks in the world, and I've yet to read anything about them going bad. And the son said, well, if they're not in trouble, then how come I keep getting these notices that say insufficient funds? You got to pay your debts. How you manage the things God gives you will be indicative of how much love you have for Him. I mean, let's face it. When we don't pay our debts, then other people are losing out. It might as well be akin to stealing or cheating somebody. Now, don't get me wrong. It's a great temptation sometimes not to pay for things. One time, one of the kids, when they were younger, went to the hospital. Went to the emergency room. And then, of course, you don't go to the emergency room unless you have to, right? Because you walk in the door, it's $500 or whatever your insurance is. I think the lowest one we ever had was $200. But at the time, $500. So we go there, and we at the hospital for a little bit, and we leave the hospital, and a couple weeks later, we get the bill. And they went ahead and itemized for me, as if they were going to anticipate what my next move was. Because they always seem to shoot high. So they itemized the bill for me, and I go and I start reading through the bill, and pretty soon I realize people must just not read these things. Because on there were some of the most ridiculous charges you would ever want to have. For instance, 2 ibuprofen. Take a guess how much 2 ibuprofen cost in the hospital. $646. Now, do you think Ed wanted to pay that? No. Ed didn't want to pay it. Did I pay it? Well, kind of. We bargained. That's ridiculous. But you know what? It's somebody else's problem. You got to pay your debts. You know, it's like all the way back in the Old Testament. It's the adage that goes along with the worker in the field. You know, and even into the New Testament, we're told the worker is worthy of his hire. An honest day's work for an honest day's wage. Those who are the children of God ought to be all about that idea of having this equity when it comes to the idea of, owing people. Now, the Bible does encourage us in a number of different places, owe no one, as Paul would say here. But the simple fact of the matter is, I don't think he's saying never take out a line of credit. I think what he's saying is if you have a debt, you need to pay it. If you get a service from somebody, you need to pay them for that service. That's the loving thing to do. That's the kind thing to do. This was clearer in previous times. But you can't turn on the radio nowadays without, do you have $50,000 more in credit card debt? Basically what they say is, for the rest of the commercial is, do you not want to pay anything on it? Just a few weeks ago we had a guy come out and say, hey, if you have credit card debt, don't pay it. Somebody else will pay it for you. That's certainly not a Christian value. If you incur a debt, then you need to pay it. I don't know. I remember the first time that I got a credit card. I was in college. I got it basically because my home was about 15 hours away. And I was driving a car that was 15 years old. And sometimes it would break down. And I had to have some kind of backup. I don't think I ever did use the card. But you know what? Every single year I'd get a bill. $35. And I'm thinking, why am I paying $35? I didn't even use the service. It was kind of a rude awakening. But if we incur a debt, if we're asking for a service, if we are receiving a service, then we need to be paying for those things. To not do that is simply not part of what God tells us that we should be as His children. Now, we don't normally think of that as a loving thing to do. But how we handle our finances, how we handle the things God has blessed us with, will show how loving we are. I think the second thing that Paul says here is because we are loved, we do no harm to anyone. Now, I'm kind of summing up what he says here, but if you go there and you read, there are a number of different ways that he mentions that we could possibly harm people. He says, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery. Well, that's harmful, right? You shall not commit no murder. Well, that's harmful. That's harmful. You shall not steal. That's harmful. You shall not covet. Well, that usually leads to things that are harmful. All of those things, he says, are summed up in this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So, in short, what Paul says is that if you love and you are a loving person, then you will not seek those things that are designed to be harmful to another person. I don't know about you, but I bought my fair share of cars. And there's only been a couple of them that, in hindsight, I wish I would have had more information. Something was wrong with the vehicle. There was one car that we bought a few years ago that when we got a closer look at it after taking it in for maintenance on a particular issue, the people revealed to us that this car's been in an accident. And they saw things in the car that made them believe that, so they went ahead and they did one of those, what do they call those reports? Carfax? Is that what they're called? They went ahead and they got one of these Carfax things on it, and sure enough, not only was it in an accident, but the accident was at a speed that was high enough that all of the airbags deployed. And they had to, redo, those things. Well, I don't want to be in a vehicle that's like that. Problem after problem after problem after problem. Now, the big thing is this. Did the people who sold that car to us know that was the case? My guess is they did. See, that's cheating. That's stealing. That's lying and deceiving. And the child of God should never conduct their business in a way that's like that. When it comes to our relationships with other people, it ought to always be above board. We ought to always treat one another with respect, Paul says. When it comes to the relationship with you and your neighbor, and you and your neighbor's wife, to go back and look at the actual command, there has to be a certain boundary that you cannot cross. You're not going to covet after the things that he has, to the point at which you desire to either take them, steal them, cheat them out of them, or something even far worse. But if we are loving, then we seek to do no harm. No harm. And people are kind of inconsistent about this. You ever notice that? It's funny. People in the world, they have, no problem with, promoting certain things that are very, very harmful to people. And yet they'll turn around and they'll say things like, tread lightly on the earth. Well, I'm all for saving the earth and I'm all for conservation, but when we're killing hundreds of thousands of babies every year, I'm not really all that concerned about the eagle or the egret or the little darter, whatever it is over here. We should seek to do no harm in all facets of our life. See, even Christ is the prime example in all of this, is he not? When he was reviled, what? He reviled not. When they pulled the hair out of his beard, when they spit on him, when they mocked him, when they tried to catch him in his words, when they put on the crown of thorns, and you can go on and on and on and on. He didn't lash out. He didn't say, I'm going to get you back. He didn't say things like, yeah, okay, there's going to be a special place in hell reserved for you. He came to seek and save the lost. And he looked down upon those crowds that were even crucifying, and he had pity for them. His heart ached for them. See, we got to have that kind of love that looks out even at the people who are doing us wrong and says, I love you anyhow. And even though you treat me wrong, I will always seek what is right for you. That's the kind of love we have to have. John Wesley, a preacher of a different era, whose works and whose name has been somewhat abused, once wrote these words about this idea. He said, do all the good you can. Do all the good you can, by all means you can, in all ways you can, in all places you can, at all times you can, to all people you can, as long as ever you can. And how true it is. We ought to be about no harm to anyone. That is the neighborly way, that is the loving way, that is the Christian way. And then the final thing I think that Paul says here is, because you love, you fulfill the law. Now, what does it mean to fulfill the law? What does it mean to fulfill the law? Is that different than keeping the law? Is it different than, doing the things that are part of the law? I mean, the law says, worship and worship this way and do all of that. fulfilling the law. I think fulfilling the law kind of takes it just a little step forward. Whereas we might say, well, we obey. Fulfilling takes it that little additional step forward and kind of indicates to us that this is not just something we do sporadically, but it is something that we do by the creation of the habit to do so. It is something that we do that has become part of who we are, just like we are loving, just like we are giving, and just like we are kind always. We are fulfilling the law. Let's go back and look at what he says here very quickly. He says, "Owe no one anything except love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." Now, do you remember when Christ was asked that question about what is the greatest command? What his answer was? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy, and it depends on what verse it is, but it's heart, mind, soul, strength, right? And then you remember he says the second is like unto it. And what is it? Love your neighbor as yourself. What do they have in common? Love, right? Love. Christ, when he gave that, was giving a summary of the law. Now, maybe you know this already, and if you do, great. Great. But all of the law, the commandments that we go back and consider as part of the law of Moses, every single one of them fall into one of those two categories. And Paul was just kind of rehashing this idea here. He's saying, look, it's all about this love that you have. Love is the defining aspect of the law. Whether it is toward God or whether it is toward man, love is that overriding principle. And I think that's part of why in that great love chapter of the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, near the end there, we are told what? Now abideth what? Faith, hope, and love. And then that last little phrase is what? But the greatest of these is love. Because love is the foundation of the law. Love is the foundation for all of the creative process that we see around us. Love will continue on in perpetuity. Hope will be realized. Faith will give way because we will see and experience. But love will still remain the modus operandi of who God is and how he treats us and the experience that we will have in eternity. It will be love. Go to that scene that Luke paints in Luke chapter 18. 18. Of the rich man and Lazarus. And on one hand, it's a very, very scary scene because you're looking at a guy who had the chance to serve. Especially with Lazarus laying at his gate every single day. And yet he doesn't raise a hand to help him out. Instead, he's wealthy, he's rich, and the Bible even tells us he had his while he was there on earth. He chose the short-term reward, is basically what God says. He chose the short-term reward. He had his. Now he's in torment. And the guy's torment is so bad that he wants just a drop of water placed on his tongue. So we have that kind of horrible picture, but then we have the contrast to it. And that is Lazarus. And he's there, and everything about that depiction of where Lazarus is seems peaceful. Now, we're not told much, but it seems like a peaceful, blissful place. If you go over to the book of Revelation, where it's described, and in other places where we have kind of these small windows of insight into that eternal dwelling, they are all joyous and peaceful scenes that emanate from the fact that God is a loving God. Now, God is just, and he therefore has to punish those who do wrong, but he's also loving. And he rewards those who have given their lives, their hearts, their energy, their wallets, their resources, their talents, their abilities, the all of who you are, to him. To him. So that he can use them in powerful ways. So notice again, Paul says, if you're going to be loving, or because you are love, or however you want to word it, because you are called to love, maybe that's a good way to put it. Because you are called to love, you will pay your debts. Now, we focused on money, and because I think that's what he talks about here. But there certainly are other kind of debts too. If we are loving, then we will not do anyone harm. We will be gentle, even in converting folks with meekness and fear. And then finally he says, because you are loved, you will fulfill the law. I like to think of it very simply as this: you will let the law fill you, and thereby fulfill the law. So Paul has a lot to say about love here. It's not the great love chapter of the Bible, but perhaps some different things, a little different angle on this notion of love. The last thing I want us to do is kind of go over to a different book, to Matthew. Over in Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. To kind of tie all these things together. And I want us to read verses 36 through 39. Matthew 22, 36 through 39. It says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" The passage we referenced earlier. And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." But the thing I really want you to notice is that next verse, where he says, "On these two commandments depend all of the law and the prophets." In other words, the short version of this, everything in all the laws of God hang upon the notion of love. Think of it as a coat rack. You have a coat rack? It's just like a little thing. It's got a pin sticking out of it, and you hang your coat on it. Imagine you have, just a string with two balls on it. You hang it over there. There are two parts of the law. You hang it on that. Remove that pin, it all falls down. Everything hangs upon the idea of love. So the challenge for us is to be loving in all of these different ways. The challenge for us is to be loving in the whole of our life. Now, again, it's not always easy. Sometimes it's very tempting to be deceitful, to cause harm, to cheat folks out of things, to not do the right thing. But rest assured, and the last thought is that it will never be the loving thing to do the wrong thing. It will always be the loving thing to do the right thing and to say the right words. Well, maybe you're here tonight and that's one of the things that you struggle with. Pray. And God will certainly help you. Maybe you're here tonight and you've read this message of love that God has given us, and you've decided that it's time for you to commit to Him. Time for you to go all in. Have you heard His word? Believed, repented of your sins, confessed the name of Christ? Have you been baptized for the remission of your sins? So you can rise to walk in newness of life? Well, what stops you? Why not tonight, as the song says? If you're here and you have some other need you wish to make known, do so as together we stand.